All right, so today we're looking at three mysteries atheism cannot adequately explain. This is just a topic that I'm really interested in. Science is something that just really interests me a lot. It always has, and obviously theology and God is interesting to me as well. So how do these things come together? Atheists, of course, would say that there is no God, and sometimes they'll invoke science. They'll claim, because we have science, we don't need God. I think that's kind of overstating their case. I think what they're going after is what's called scientism. Scientism is the belief that the only way you can find truth about anything is through scientific investigation. That really, when we talk about anything beyond empirical, observable evidence, you can't really make truth claims about anything. As Christians, and a lot of people, not just Christians, we don't believe that this is the case. We believe that science is one way of knowing things, but it's not the only way of knowing things. And as Christians, we would say that science done well gives us a picture of reality. Theology done well gives us a picture of reality. And so there should be no disconnect between science done well and theology done well. If there's ever a conflict between faith and science, it's because we're interpreting the Bible wrong, or we're interpreting the natural data, the evidence from nature wrong, or both. So I just want us to see that as Christians we say there's no division, as if science is like facts and theology or God would be more like values that we privately hold. A comprehensive view of reality would say that God is and nature is, and those things go together well. The title of this is Three Mysteries Atheism Cannot Adequately Explain. I'm not saying that atheists don't explain these mysteries. I just don't think they explain them adequately. They're not intellectually satisfying for me or for many other people. Now, what I want to do here is I want to do a couple things. I want to give you some confidence in when you're speaking with people who are atheists and might claim the science card. I also want to give you a confidence in your own faith that when we talk about God, we are talking about reality. We're not just talking about, oh, these are just the beliefs that we privately hold, and when you're doing science, this is just like the real hardcore, evidence-based stuff. Now, none of what I'm going to talk about today, I don't want you to take this out into your workplace or your families as like a slam dunk argument. I don't think you can use science to prove God. In the same way, I don't think you can use science to disprove God. Science is a neutral enterprise. I mean, you look at the evidence, it tells you how something works, but it doesn't tell you why it exists. Science can tell you a lot about the way that nature works, but it's not going to tell you why something exists or ultimately for what purpose it exists, like what's the meaning of life and things like that. Some more recent atheists like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett and Sam Harris and some of these guys, what they're kind of going after is they're trying to say that anything that you do in life, whether it be falling in love or going to church or anything, it can all be explained naturally. And so I just don't think that is an adequate explanation for the fullness of the human experience. Now, like I said, don't take this out into the world as kind of like a slam dunk argument. What it is really what you want to do is you want to kind of put a stone in somebody's shoe. Give them something to think about that they might not have considered when it comes to God and some of the bigger questions. Think back to Jesus in John chapter 10. Remember how Jesus raised Lazarus? Oh, it's John chapter 11. Jesus raised Lazarus, and when people saw Lazarus raised, many people believed, right? But if you read the text closely, a lot of people tried all the more to have Jesus arrested after they saw that miracle. When it comes down to it, I really think that atheism is more of a heart matter than a head matter. I mean, if people want to find reasons to not believe in God, they probably will. So as you're interacting and talking with people, you just got to be aware of that you can bring up this evidence for God. You can point out the things that really don't make much sense with atheism and these three mysteries we'll look at. But if somebody doesn't want to believe in God, they're not going to believe in God. It's kind of more of a, very often I think it's more of a heart matter than a head matter. You got people like the atheist Thomas Nagel saying, it's not just that I don't believe there's a God, I don't want there to be a God. Because what would somebody have to give up? How would their life change if they admitted that there is this cosmic authority that has claim on their lives? So here we go. Three mysteries atheism cannot adequately explain. We have three of them. How did the universe begin? How did life begin? And what is consciousness? I want to begin with a quote from G.K. Chesterton. He writes this in his book, The Everlasting Man. He wrote this about roughly 100 years ago. He says, "No philosopher denies that a mystery still attaches to the two great transitions, the origin of the universe itself and the origin of the principle of life itself. Most philosophers have the enlightenment to add that a third mystery attaches to the origin of man himself. In other words, a third bridge was built across the third abyss of the unthinkable when there came into the world what we call reason and what we call will." So Chesterton is pointing out that the first mystery is, why is there something instead of nothing? Why does something exist instead of nothing at all? The second is, how did life originate? How did the inorganic pass to the organic? How did non-living things, non-living inanimate matter, develop the capacity to be able to be animate, thinking? And then finally, this thing called reason or will, that thing that marks us as human beings, that we're able to reason, that we have things like art and religion and literature and things like that. How do we get to that place of human consciousness? Those are three really big mysteries. As we look at the first one, how did the universe begin? This is really interesting. In the reading I was doing, we all grew up probably hearing about the Big Bang, and that's the standing theory of the origin of the universe. And with that is the idea that the universe, that space and time had a very sudden beginning. But if you go back several decades in mainstream science, the belief was not that there was a sudden beginning to anything. The belief was commonly held, not by evidence, just really by presupposition, that we live in an eternal static universe. So you have this quote from Sir Arthur Eddington. He says, "Philosophically, the notion of a beginning to the present order of nature is repugnant. I should like to find a genuine loophole. We must allow evolution an infinite time to get started." So first I want to point out in this quote, we have this assumption that the universe is eternal, that material things have always existed. There never was a time when it was not. The second thing I want to point out is that when Eddington's talking about needing enough time for evolution, he's not talking about evolution in the sense of the species and the diversities that we see through natural selection. He's not talking about that. He's talking about needing enough time for the evolution of non-life to become life, what we call chemical evolution. That it's so unlikely, it's so highly improbable that non-living things would produce living things, that we need an eternal universe so you have enough chances. We'll see this again when we get to the what we call multiverse theory, the idea that there's an infinite amount of universes, because you need that kind of odds to get the improbable, impossible development of life by chance. As far as evolution is, that's a whole different presentation. I'm not going to really get too far into that. I'm going to kind of use the language and speak according to the whole timeline of billions and millions of years. Different Christians have different opinions on this. So you have some Christians who have a very strict literal reading of Genesis 1 through 11, specifically Genesis 1 through 3. They're going to go for a strict literal 6-day, 24-hour creation. And then you have other Christians who take the Bible very seriously but would still allow room for or admit some kind of evolution and follow basically the reigning scientific theory on the diversity that we see in the biological world. I'm not going to get into that because it's a whole other presentation. But I will say this, is that Christians come to different conclusions while taking the Bible very seriously, looking at how do we interpret these first 3 and broadly 11 chapters of Genesis. But that's the thing with the word evolution, is that sometimes you mean multiple different things by it. You have to really ask, what do you mean by evolution? And in this case, for the purpose of today, when I'm talking about evolution, I'm specifically talking about the idea of chemical evolution, meaning that you could have non-living matter eventually becoming living. That kind of evolution. Then you got this guy, Albert Einstein. I'm sure you're familiar with him. He develops the theory of relativity, and that just had huge implications. Because if you follow relativity, then you get to this idea that the universe, that time and space had a very sudden beginning. And that was really revolutionary, and it really challenged the scientific paradigm at the time. People didn't really know what to do with this. The idea that there is a first, that there's a beginning to everything that we see in this world. So with the Big Bang, theory of relativity implies the beginning to time and space. Many scientists recognize the theistic implications. And it's interesting that sometimes you'll read these quotes by physicists or cosmologists or astronomers, and they almost kind of speak in theistic terms, meaning God, or in pantheistic terms, meaning they speak about the universe almost as being conscious, like the universe knew we were coming, things like that, because when they look at it, the grandeur of the universe and the improbability that it arose just by chance, sometimes they speak in this way, even if they don't hold to those beliefs. So physicist Hugh Ross says, if the universe is the aftermath of an explosion, then there must have been a beginning to the explosion, a moment at which the pin was pulled. By the simple law of cause and effect, it must have had a beginner. So as we've been able in recent decades to look beyond our Earth and get a better picture of the universe, there's some evidence that just really makes the Big Bang look like the best hypothesis. So for example, you can see the universe cooling after the initial hot explosion, seeing all the old light, universe expanding and all that. It's allowed us to have a pretty good picture of how the universe began very suddenly in time and space. So once again, Hugh Ross, he says, astronomers who do not draw theistic or deistic conclusions are becoming rare, and even the few dissenters hint that the tide is against them. That's also because, it's not only because you have something arising out of nothing that's difficult for an atheistic view of the universe. You also have that we live in this just right universe. You've got these 4 factors: gravity, the electromagnetic, the strong nuclear force, and the weak nuclear force. And if you kind of picture, like in our up above the sanctuary, we've got that soundboard with all the dials, and you got to have all the dials to have a good mix when you're doing music. In the same way, if the universe is going to exist in the way that we know it now, in a way that can support life, all those dials have to be just right. And so the probability that all those forces are just right are really improbable that it would just happen like that. So it's really interesting. Then you read about all these different kind of loopholes that exist. You can kind of see that some atheists are kind of backed into a corner with the evidence, and so they come up with some ways out of this improbable, just so happening by chance universe. So you have a minority of scientists that deny the Big Bang. I think that's kind of rare, but I think the minority exists. Some would propose an infinitely expanding and contracting universe. It's like the Big Bang and then the Big Crunch, and it just goes on and on forever. And sometimes you'll see those same people talking about this in sort of pantheistic terms, kind of like reincarnation, like death and rebirth over and over again. At that point, they're doing philosophy, maybe even theology instead of science. Some would propose an infinite amount of universes. I think this is kind of popular right now. This is called multiverse theory. And it's the idea that you have an infinite amount of universes to account for the improbable event of this universe existing. So since the probability is so unlikely that this universe would exist as it is to produce life, what you need is an infinite amount of dice rolls for this kind of thing to happen. And then some look to quantum theory. I don't understand quantum theory that well. I've done a little reading on it, and what I understand is that, maybe some of you know more than me, but that when at a certain point, the laws of physics that we know, the rules don't apply. And so you get somebody like Stephen Hawking saying, according to the laws of physics, we now know that the universe can come about from nothing. And I'm assuming that he's making a reference to some kind of quantum theory. The problem, though, is that, but where did the laws come from? I mean, it's simple to say that the universe, because of the laws of physics that we know, that the universe can just come into being by itself. But where did the laws or principles come from that allowed for that? Concerning all these loopholes, these are all variations on a theme in that they all propose the introduction of some unknown, undiscovered physics to alter the physics we do know, can measure, and understand. Now, the Christian worldview, I think, just makes better sense of the fact that the universe exists, both its origin and its purpose. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. God stands as the cause of everything that we see and experience. Hebrews 11, by faith we understand that the universe was created by the Word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. Psalm 19:1 says that the heavens declare the glory of God, the sky above proclaims his handiwork. If you've ever seen that movie, Contact, is that the movie with Jodie Foster, where I think there's a quote in there where really the question of the movie is there life, is there extraterrestrial life somewhere out there in the universe? And if there isn't, that's a big waste of space, right? I think that was one of the quotes, is if there's no life out there, that's a big waste of space. Well, that's kind of a human-centered way of looking at it. We're assuming that this universe exists for us. But if God created it in all of its grandeur and glory, it's his universe, and he's allowed to make it as big as he wants. And it's not a waste of space if it's for his glory. You have this quote from John Calvin. He says that creation is a platform for God's glory, a dazzling theater. So when we look above, below, to the right, to the left, everything that we see in creation is for God's glory. It's a picture of how awesome and how wise and how powerful he is. So according to the atheistic view, the universe just exists because it does. And the question of why isn't really a good question. But as Christians, we can look at both the cause being God and the purpose being his glory and our enjoyment of that creation. So I like that it actually gives us a purpose for everything that exists. This isn't just a big mistake, an accident, an improbable event that happened. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the question of life. The first thing I want to point out is that it's really interesting how unique our planet is. I mean, we don't know the universe in its extent. I mean, there's so much of the universe we don't know. I was listening to NPR the other day, and they were talking about all these different kinds of matter, like dark matter and stuff like that. Only 5% of the universe supposedly is made up of the stuff that we're made out of. And there's all this other stuff we just don't know about. Now, we have really no way of exploring that tangibly right now. But as far as we know, if the rest of the universe is like most of our solar system, it's not a place that's hospitable for life. And then you have this planet, this little speck hanging out in our solar system, which itself is a speck in our galaxy, and our galaxy is a speck in our universe. We have this little planet hanging out that is very, very, very nice conditions for life. So there's so many different factors here. We're just in the right part of the galaxy, not too much gravity or too little. We're in just the right solar system with just the right star that's not too old or too young or too bright. We're just the right distance from the sun. We have the right planets. For example, if we didn't have Jupiter and its strong gravitational pull, we'd be exposed to an assault of asteroids and things like that. which would not be good for our planet and life. So I just want to begin with that point, is that it's not only highly unlikely that life would originate by itself, it's also highly unlikely that the right conditions would exist. So how did life begin? Well, according to the atheistic materialist point of view, where all that exists is matter, it's time plus chance equals life. Given enough time and the right conditions, eventually chemical evolution would produce the first simple cell. So Richard Dawkins has recently said that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. The issue here, though, is that when Darwin wrote The Origin of the Species back in the middle of the 19th century, he knew far less than we know now about even the simplest cell. So it was easy for Darwin to say, I imagine that in some early Earth warm pond or something, that eventually life could originate by itself, the first simple cell. Now, during Darwin's time, cells were thought to be just like really simple, just like a membrane and plasma, like a jelly, and that's it. But as we've gotten to know more, we see that a cell is more like a city. I mean, any of you who've studied in high school or college or beyond, cellular biology, you look at a cell and it's like a city. It's got all these checks and balances. It's got all these different purposes and jobs. If one of those things isn't working, the whole thing falls apart. So it's hard to believe that all these things could come together in a way that the first cell could be formed in a way where all the parts need to be moving and working so the whole thing doesn't fall apart. And then not only that, but be able to self-replicate. See, that's the big chasm you got to jump over. It's not just that these things would come together by natural processes, but also that you'd, in that first generation, develop the ability to self-replicate. When I was in high school, the big experiment that we read about in our biology textbooks was the Stanley Miller experiment at the University of Chicago in 1953. And the idea was, if you could recreate what the atmosphere or the conditions were in the early Earth, then maybe you could demonstrate that life can be created by natural means alone. And so the idea was that so what Stanley Miller did is he created in a laboratory what he thought were the early Earth conditions. And it was kind of a groundbreaking experiment because what he found was that amino acids began to congeal, like the stuff that, of amino acids began to congeal at the bottom. And a lot of, like Time magazine, I think, had like a front page article saying like the mystery of life solved. This is no longer the reigning theory. There's some things that don't work with it. For one, some have questioned if Miller got the early conditions of the Earth right. And then also, there's the issue of amino acids are a long way from the first cell, and even a long way from the structure of what we call DNA and the information involved therein. So it's a big chasm still to cross. Let's move on to DNA, because this is where it really gets interesting. This is where, so Darwin had no knowledge of DNA, so it was easy for him to say, maybe a long, long time ago, in this hypothetical warm pond, life could originate. Well, in 1953, I believe it was, Francis Crick and James Watson discovered DNA. If you ever want to read an interesting story, read about the starts and the stops and the winding path that these two guys took to discover DNA. Really interesting. And what they discovered is that DNA is functional biological information. So what I mean by this is if I take this book here and I hand it to you, this is full of information, right? But let's say that you don't speak English. Is this functional information? Is it functional for you? Of course not. It's just like zeros and ones, right? I mean, with some technology it's functional, with some it's not. With some readers this is functional information, for some it's not. So you have the information as it's arranged, and you need a mind that understands English to read it and comprehend it. It's the same way with DNA, that you have this functional information. It's not just junk information. It's information um, that is geared towards the building of amino acids and proteins and cells and all that. So now, here's where it gets interesting, is that if you're a scientist and you're going and you're looking for the cause of an event, like a once-in-a-lifetime event, say, for example, you find in a fossil bed, you find a bunch of fossils of different prehistoric animals all congealed together in the fossil bed. It looks like they all died at the same time. Now, what you're going to do is you're going to use the tool of abductive reasoning. You're going to go back, you're going to look at known causes like floods and mudslides, avalanches, stuff like that, and you're going to make a hypothesis based on known causes to figure out what happened then. You're not going to come up with a bizarre cause like maybe all of these prehistoric creatures were part of a cult and they all, drank the Kool-Aid at the same time and they died. That just doesn't make any sense because we don't have any evidence of that. So you take a known cause and you bring that known cause into the past to create multiple working hypotheses. Well, with the origin of life, this is a one-time event. It happened. Life began. Now, what's the only known cause that we have for intelligence? Or let me phrase that differently. What's the only known cause that we have for information? Intelligence. The only way that we know that intelligence is created or information is created is through a mind, through intelligence. We see crystals, snowflakes that will make these patterns, but it's more of like an ABC, ABC, ABC pattern that repeats itself. But for highly organized functional information, you need intelligence. And so that's why some people would say, in order to account for DNA, we have to account for intelligence. That's the only known cause we can read into the past. So the question is, how does functional information arise naturally? That's the question. That's the kind of the burden that's laid on the atheist view of the world. So biologist Stephen Meyer says, apart from the molecules comprising the gene expression system and the machinery of the cell, sequences or structures exhibiting such specified complexity are not found anywhere in the natural, that is, the non-human world. How did these digitally encoded and specifically sequenced instructions in DNA arise? And how did they arise within a channel for transmitting information? So that's the question, is how did all this arise naturally when you need intelligence to create information? So you have the head of the Human Genome Project, the former head of the Human Genome Project, Francis Collins, who's also a Christian. He says, no current hypothesis comes close to explaining how in the space of a mere 150 million years, the prebiotic environment that existed on planet Earth gave rise to life. That is not to say that reasonable hypotheses have been put forward, but their statistical probability of accounting for the development of life still seems remote. So what he's saying there is that how life originated by natural causes alone is just highly improbable statistically, and there's been some theories put forward. We'll talk about a couple of them in a moment, but none of them have really sealed the deal. Now I want to share with you a quote from an atheist, Thomas Nagel. I like Thomas Nagel because he's an honest atheist. He doesn't have an agenda like Richard Dawkins or Daniel Dennett does, where they're not going to be honest about the really tough questions. I like Thomas Nagel because though he's an atheist, he's really honest about some of the real difficulties that exist for his view of the world. Nagel says, at this point, the origin of life remains. This is from an article talking about difficulties with the whole materialistic, atheistic view of the world. At this point, the origin of life remains in light of what is known about the huge size, the extreme specificity, and the exquisite functional precision of the genetic material a mystery, an event that could not have occurred by chance and to which no significant probability can be assessed on the basis of what we know of the laws of physics and chemistry. So that's an atheist, Thomas Nagel, being honest about this problem. Dawkins and Dennett and these guys, they don't like Nagel because he's honest about This is kind of treason to speak this way, right? So there's some loopholes that we look for. One is this idea of self-organization, that just matter can somehow self-organize itself to create this specified information. But again and again, that just hasn't held water. The other is the idea of order from within known causes. So for example, if you take a bath and you drain the bath water, you'll see that the gravity creates this structure, this vortex. And so the thought is that maybe there's some force in nature that would somehow create this order, this information that we see in the structure of DNA and in cells and the like. But once again, none of that's been discovered, and it doesn't really hold water very well. There's a computer program developed, I think it's called Avida. I'd have to go look it up, but the idea is that they created this algorithm, this computer program that's able to show how life can independently form, that structure can come out of chaos, that kind of thing. The problem is that it took a human being to engineer the computer and that software. So if you step back a few steps, it just doesn't make much sense. By the way, if you want to read about this, if you have a background in biology or all, this shouldn't be too hard. It's called The Signature in the Cell by Stephen Meyer, DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design. Oh, look, Thomas Nagel recommends it. It's a good book. He says, a careful presentation of this fiendishly difficult problem. I'd really encourage you to take a look at this if you want to dig deeper on this. I'm kind of running out of time, so I'm not going to focus on other issues. But I just want to talk a moment about the Christian worldview. So as Christians, our worldview centers around the kind of intelligence that would be able to create life. God is all-knowing, He's all-powerful, He's all-present. And so that accounts for the origin of life with a divine cause. From the Christian worldview, this makes sense. Why did God create life? Psalm 150, let everything that has breath praise the Lord. Man and woman are created in the image of God, not just by accident, but on purpose, that we would know Him, right? We are to be reflectors of His goodness and His glory. We are to know and enjoy Him and receive His gifts as part of His creation. We are created to be in relationship with Him and with one another. That is what marks us different among all the species. And so, whereas the atheistic view of the origin of life would say that life was accidental, it had no greater purpose, as Christians we would say that life had both a cause and it has a purpose. And this has huge implications for morality and ethics, human rights. I mean, we could go on a different tangent there. This, I think, is the real, crazy interesting question is, what is consciousness? And it's a fun question to think about because it takes consciousness to think about consciousness. We kind of just take consciousness for granted, but why should we, as material beings, be able to comprehend and think about the stuff around us? In fact, you get, there's a New York Times article in 2014, I think, that was really questioning, are we even conscious at all? That this consciousness thing is such a mystery. Maybe consciousness is an illusion created by evolution. Now, the thing I find kind of funny is that it takes consciousness to assert that we're not conscious, I think a lot of this just kind of backs itself into a dead end, but so here's an article from Rod Rosenbaum in Slate. He says, consider for instance the problem of the origin and nature of consciousness. The failure to solve it without resorting to some religion or quasi-religious intelligent design, which offers no real solution since it doesn't explain what created the consciousness behind the intelligence of intelligent design. strikes many observers as dangerous. Dangerous because it threatens the foundation of scientific rationalism and materialism. Dangerous because it disrupts one's sense of any order in the universe and opens the floodgates of chaos. I appreciate this quote because, once again, it's somebody approaching the world from an atheistic viewpoint, saying this is a really tough problem. And it's kind of dangerous because it threatens what we take for granted, that there is no God and that all that there is matter. But I want to point out a flaw in thinking here. He just kind of dismisses the idea of God because that would not account for the consciousness of God. But Christians have never had a problem with this. We believe that God is self-existent, that he has no beginning and no end. And really the atheist and the Christian have the same problem. There has to be something that exists or someone that exists in and of itself with no prior cause. So I don't think he's doing that justice right there. I think he just kind of avoids even considering what is not plausible for him. Once again, he goes on about consciousness. What is it? That is it made up of the same elementary particles, quarks, that make up the rest of the universe? If not, what sort of material is it? Where does it exist? If it exists in the mind, is the mind contained in the brain? Does the mind differ from the brain? Is it determined by the brain and thus functionally non-independent? I mean, you think about this. If you're approaching consciousness from an atheistic viewpoint, what you're saying is that inanimate matter, just stuff, eventually developed the capacity as animate matter to think and comprehend itself. And ask questions like, why am I here? What's the purpose of life? Where am I going? It just doesn't seem all that plausible. Here you have Jerry Coyne. He writes in his book, Faith versus Fact. He's a notable atheist. He says, ultimately, its solution, consciousness, may evade us for one reason. We're using our limited cognitive abilities to tackle a research project that is hard even to frame. We're forced to use an organ that evolved for other reasons to study how that organ makes us feel. So and Darwin even talks about this. Darwin feared that what if our minds evolved, from animals, do not have the capacity to rightly interpret reality. If our minds had just evolved just to survive, then are we able to actually see the world as it is? And so I think that Coyne is getting to this. He's saying, look, it's hard to talk about consciousness and what is it and how did it arise, because our minds didn't evolve to ask these kinds of questions. So we can't trust our brains. But see, this cuts both ways, because if you can't trust your brain because of evolution, then how can you trust the scientific theory of evolution from A to Z? You see where I'm going there? Is that if your mind is just a product of time and chance, natural selection, designed for certain things like survival, then why should we trust the scientific method? Maybe our senses are deceiving us. I think that a Christian view of things gives us a better way of doing science. I think it's no mistake that science began in Christian Europe. Because if we believe that God created the heavens and the earth, that means he created a predictable universe that behaves in the same way because it's upheld by his laws. And that means that you can do scientific investigation and know that your senses aren't deceiving you, and know that there's really a world out there to explore and to really glory in. So according to the Christian worldview, consciousness is not an accident, but rather it's a part of the image of God in human beings. So the existence of God secures the material world outside of us. We can trust that there really is a world that our senses are interacting with, and that our senses are not deceiving us. And furthermore, because God created, that means that the universe was perceived before the arrival of rational creatures. What I mean by that is, if there is no God and the universe just happened by blind chance and all that there is stuff, matter, then what was the universe existing in reference to before human beings were able to look up and comprehend it and think rationally about it? So you even have some scientists, and here they're doing philosophy more than they're doing science. They're saying, maybe to some extent the universe didn't exist until human consciousness, because the universe needed to have perception, to be perceived by something, because as far as it's concerned, it doesn't exist unless it's perceived. I know this is getting kind of deep and philosophical, but think about God. God has always perceived the universe and beheld it in all of its glory before human beings ever existed. And then we have the joy of seeing what he's already seen. Who was it? Was it Kepler that said that, or was it Copernicus? It was Kepler who said that science is thinking God's thoughts after him. And, he's thought all this out, he's seen all this, and we get the privilege of seeing it and discovering it as well. So that is pretty much it. I mean, there's a lot more we could talk about with all of these. I just kind of gave you a brief overview. And just in general, I just don't think that atheism makes the best sense of these three questions. I mean, we could talk about a lot of reasons that atheism doesn't make sense, why it doesn't offer us a good, comprehensive view of reality. But I think that these three questions especially cause issues. We've got, maybe if we just have like 5 minutes for questions, then we'll still have 10 minutes before worship. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
Yes, are you saying that from the Christian worldview that the human behavior can be expected, and from the atheist worldview it's hard to explain them?
Well, okay, so human behavior, and this gets into a whole different territory. So this recent discipline is called evolutionary psychology, and the idea is that everything that you do, anything that you do, is all a product of natural selection. So even the fact that people are religious, there has to be some naturalistic reason that religion benefited our ancestors. And so and it gets kind of tricky sometimes. So even there's this famous geneticist, I can't remember his name, but he says that really these are kind of just so stories. They're kind of like, there's no evidence for a lot of this stuff that evolutionary psychology says. It's kind of like, why do elephants have ears? Some of these kind of fable stories. We'll say, oh, well, this is advantageous for this reason or that reason. But then it gets kind of tricky, because then you have stuff like altruism. Like, people will give their lives for causes or even for people that they don't know, people who are their enemies. That's not really good for passing on your genes. So yeah, that's a really detailed question. I think the Christian worldview would allow for natural explanations for why we behave in certain ways. It's just not going to be the A to Z. I mean, part of the image of God is that God has breathed his life into us and given us certain characteristics that make us uniquely human. Yeah. What else?
Would you mind giving the title of that book you held up again?
Oh yeah, this is called The Signature in the Cell by Stephen C. Meyer, M-E-Y-E-R. It's a great book. I'd say all you really need is if you took high school biology and you paid attention, you'll be fine. And he explains a lot of stuff in here, and he gives a whole wealth of reading that you can look at. Yeah, it's good. Anything else? Yeah.
So, one of the things that's talked about is how where we are is perfect and perfectly balanced and so forth, but we don't believe that the creation is perfect anymore because of the corruption that we introduced. Is that dealt with anywhere in how do Christian scientists or theistic scientists think about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is it, well, first, do we live in the best of all possible worlds? And obviously there's this Romans 8, we talk about creation groaning, creation straining, being burdened under sin, that creation does not, in some sense, know its full potential. There's a lot of debate here. So it gets to questions of like, is death natural to some extent? And so you have to think about living in the best of all possible worlds. Is this the best of all possible worlds that God created? And some theologians would argue, well, what do we mean by that, right? So we live in a world where, even before the fall, I think it would be possible to feel pain because we have a nervous system. And, even if there weren't things like disease and death, you can still fall off a cliff. There's these things that can happen. And so God has created a world that is very functional and good, but does good mean perfect? What do we mean by perfect? When God looked at everything and said it was good, what did he mean by that? Some people would argue that good means it's functional, it works well. But yeah, there's a lot of debate on that, and it's very nuanced. And if you're interested in some reading on that, I can reference you to it. Yeah. How about one more?
How do atheists define or explain evil in the world?
How do atheists define or explain evil? Oh, that's a great question. We could spend a lot of time on that. Well, if you press them enough, you're going to find out that there really is no such thing as evil. We can talk about things being advantageous or disadvantageous. When you look at nature, nature is kind of red tooth and red claw, right? You got the strong prey on the weak. But for some reason, we as human beings don't think that we should live that way. If you really press an atheist on that, say, well, why shouldn't we live that way? Why were the Nazis wrong for what they did? I mean, they were living kind of out the implications of natural selection. They were saying, the strong prey on the weak. If you want something, take it. Who cares about treaties and laws and morality? Now, you'll see these kind of contrived efforts, I think they're contrived, to try to account for morality apart from God. And it's always, see, if there is no morality that comes from God, all that's left is power. This is Nietzsche a little bit. All that's left is power. And when people say this is right or wrong, when people get angry about politics, when they get angry about policies, when people talk about human rights, in the absence of God, all we're talking about is who makes the more powerful argument in the absence of real right or wrong. Yeah. But that's very perceptive that, yes, I mean, if there is no God, then how can we talk about a moral accountability that holds us all together? That's written on the heart. All right, well, thank you, everybody. Next week, we're going to talk about why would God judge people for the way they live. I think that is important in our culture because we live in a culture where you can't judge anybody. And Jesus said don't judge, but God judges. So what's going on? We'll talk about that next week.